Right, so my name's Lauren Goshinski, and I'm apparently in charge of lots of things, including this panel. And yay, all right, but thank you. First, I'd just like to thank MUTEC and Keychange for having all of us here. Myself and these panel members, which I'll introduce to you in just a minute, we're meeting each other for the first time in person. And there's a thing to be said about like reading the room, right? So I'm trying to like take it all in and start to think about maybe the questions that I prepared and how we might bob and weave with one another through today. But I would like to say I was pretty stoked when Patty asked me to moderate this panel because I got to use my favorite emoji, and that's a new one for me. But I would like to set a tone first for this panel. I think that I'd like to set some goals. One is not to drive this panel with any idea that we're going to come up with like a singular answer for any of these hot button issues. They are so big and so unwieldy, and we have 45 minutes. But we have people on this panel that have a lot of different experiences and expertise, and I think that they're going to be able to share with you perhaps like thinking processes or maybe some practical experiences or solutions to addressing some of these issues. And I would also like to encourage all of us, because we're in a pretty privileged position to be here, that we look at these topics as reflections of ourselves and start to question perhaps like our own internalized biases and kind of perpetuating maybe some of the issues that we are simultaneously calling out. And with that, my panel intro was not as good as, hey, someone else's. Hot buttons, quotas, biology, meritocracy, and more. Those words are really overwhelming. And let me quickly introduce our panelists. I had to get this one written down. Okay, so Roxanne Arsenault, otherwise known as the artist Donzelle, is a musician and artist who recently released the album Prejus. Is that who's? Prejus. That's my French for the day. That explores different themes ranging from sisterhood, girl gangs, masturbation, and motherhood. You're currently the curator at Clark Gallery, correct? And you've been a curator and an organizer behind lots of Montreal's creative scenes, including that you were the president of Pop Montreal for 3 years. Jonathan Sterne, on your far right. Jonathan is a James McGill Professor of Culture and Technology in the Department of Art History and Communications at McGill. The Harvard of Canada, right? Is that what that is?
I didn't say that.
I saw it on the internet. It must be true. And you're the author of books such as MP3, The Meaning of a Format, and lots of different articles on media, technologies, and the politics of culture. You're also the editor of the Sound Studies Reader, co-editor of the Participatory Condition in Digital Age. And your projects are considering the politics of instruments and signal processing, the integration of artificial intelligence and culture, and the intersections of disability, technology, and perception. Lucas Charlie Rose, sitting here to my left. Yeah. Lucas Charlie Rose is a Montreal-based recording artist, rapper, trans rights, and Black Lives Matter activist. He produced the world's first trans hip-hop mixtape, which was entirely produced, written, and featuring trans people. He's the founder of the nonprofit record label Trenderz, which aims to provide trans artists with the resources they need to make music and uplift their narratives. And as I read on your website, the goal is to have trans artists on stage at the Grammys. Yeah, snaps. All right, Magdalena Olszanowski. Yes. As a person with a Polish name, like to get another Polish name wrong is like, it's just so wrong. So I'm so glad I got that one right. You're an artist, a PhD candidate in communication studies at Concordia, and you're also a faculty in media arts at John Abbott College. She's recently co-edited a special issue on women in electronic music with Rebecca Farrugia for Dance Cult, which is a journal of electronic dance music culture. And she is currently working on a documentary entitled Micro-Feminine Warfare that features women in experimental electronic music. She's led numerous workshops on image and sound technologies. She's leading a VJ workshop as part of this program. and has been discussing the issue of women in electronic music in various forms since the early aughts. So that's all about us. Okay. Yeah. All right. So I picked some visual prompts and some text prompts just to help us move through these pretty like deep wells of conversations. And I called a lot of things from the interwebs to keep it light, but to also illustrate that the way we talk about these issues there are many entry points into how we discuss these issues and the languages that we're using to kind of wrestle with them. So, oh my God, female composer, I love your work. I'd like to talk first about the high point. Sorry, y'all. Binary and bias. Just to set the stage, obviously, like working with the binary is a construct that we all know very well, and it's something that we internalize regardless of our identification. And we have biases in all directions, you know, including our gender, our race, our class. These are all things that we're coming to the table with today. One thing that I'd like to begin with our panel, with our panelists, is as all of us are people saying that we would like to dismantle some of these structures in moving forward. And I'd like to just first understand from you personally, for you as an artist or a researcher, can you give me some examples of how binary and or bias is currently influencing your work and your research? Is there perhaps a particular challenge that you're dealing with right here today? Or is there something that you've been dealing with for your entire life that you continue to struggle with? And I would like to maybe start with Lucas, if you don't mind.
Hi. Well, I mean, first of all, if we're going to talk about gender, that's where the most important, like, binary is, right? Because everybody sees the world as being, like, male and female. And I use these words, like, because it's not about being a man or a woman, because if it was, we wouldn't have that binary. It's about being male or female. That's how people see the world. And so when we talk about gender in the music industry, for example, and you said, like, oh, I want to bring trans people at the Grammy Awards, you know? And everybody's like, oh, the industry is a male, like a men's world or whatever. And to that, when people tell me that, I'm like, if it was, I would be able to pay rent. You know what I mean? Because technically, I mean, I identify as non-binary, but like in the world, because most people don't know what that is, I just say I'm a man. And but it's not about my identity, like how I identify as. It's about the way that people perceive me. Because if it truly was a men's world, then you would see trans men on stage at the Grammys. But the reality is that you see more cis women making it in that industry than you see trans men. And so that's how you can tell, like, it's not about how somebody identifies, it's about how they're perceived. Because when people treat me, like the way people treat me in this industry, like, I've seen both sides, right? Because I spent the first 22 years of my life being seen as a woman. And honestly, when I transitioned, people started treating me worse when the industry, like, it was harder for me to book gigs. It was harder for me to get fans, harder for me to, like, have somebody listen to me, harder to do everything. And especially as a man of color, like as a trans man of color, on top of that, you have, you know, racism. You know, being a hip hop artist, especially, a lot of people don't see that, like, don't think that's professional. And yeah, so that's basically, like, how I want to say, like, the binary, especially when we're talking about gender and gender equality and gender, like, disparities between the gender. Most people are talking about cis people. They're not talking about trans people, because there is a huge inequality between cis women and trans men, for example. There's a huge, even bigger inequality between cis women and trans women. And so, yeah, basically, that's what I wanted to say.
Maybe I could jump quickly to Jonathan, actually. We have these biases, like, baked in, you know, at every level. And you've done a lot of research just in terms of the technologies that we use and gender bias in the actual equipment that we use. Would you mind?
Yeah, sure. And I'm going to just throw out some terms to, like, you know, they say name the behavior. So I'm going to do that. Although I just want to echo one thing Lucas said, because I think it's super important that, even very educated people, scholars who think about this stuff for a living, are still struggling with this, like in basic categories. So let's say, which is true, I would like to write a history of trans people and modular synthesizer use in the 70s and 80s. Even that category is incredibly difficult because, of course, some people who transitioned don't want to be thought of as trans, and some do. Do you include them in the history? Do you not include them in the history? How do you think about that? Like, it's a complicated thing, even in terms of telling the story, because the trans movement has been around forever, but in terms of having broader impact on how people theorize gender and sexuality and sex, it's really been coming on in the last couple decades, I'd say. So those are real problems. Okay, so I'm just gonna throw out some terms. First term, indirect sexism, which is like indirect discrimination, which is probably a fancy term for microaggression, which is also a fancy term, I guess. But this is something you see all the time in the world of music and music technology, right? So there's this idea of, for instance, gendered instruments, right? In the orchestra, more women take up flute, more men take up double bass, for instance, although we can all think of exceptions to that. So the idea that certain people play certain instruments. Now, people who believe in, sort of biological determinism, right, that your biology somehow shapes who you are, what you do, will say, well, that's a result of nature. But the thing is, our institutions are so biased and so messed up that if that nature existed, we would have no way of knowing. So you look at music teachers, for instance, in schools, and the way they talk about boys' performance and girls' performance, they will use different adjectives. You can see the same thing in music criticism. Open up the latest issue of The Wire and see whose, rhythms are throbbing and whose are delicate, for instance. They're there, the words are there. I'm just pointing to something that's there. So this is something that happens all the time, right? And another term that I find quite useful is gendered space. So when you walk into a space, what vibe do you get? And I can give an example of this from my own world. A group of us were thinking about building a digital humanities lab where people would come together and make things, and we really wanted it to be a feminist space. And so you look at labs around universities, like it's very rare that there are plants there, except there's one lab at Concordia where they're trying to use plants to like control computers and stuff, which is cool. But is the furniture comfortable? Is it a warm, welcoming space? Or is it, all Doritos and Mountain Dew and like dirty, cluttered surfaces with superhero figurines, right? How do you make the space welcoming and open? Who do you assume is going to be there? I've been at many gatherings of musicians where the presumptive pronoun is he and his, and it's certainly a cis pronoun. And that's one of the other things, even when we name something like institutional sexism, that doesn't mean we've automatically covered trans people's experiences. There's a long history, like with the Women's Music Festival in Michigan, around sort of feminist politics not lining up with trans politics. So it's also something I think we need to work through. So two terms, gendered spaces, indirect discrimination, useful for pointing out things that you probably have lived and seen every day, and can also think about in your own practice, like what language do I use, right? So you had the like, hey, woman composer, female composer, yeah. Same thing, like would I describe a woman's or a trans man's work differently than a cis man simply because of the gender identity I'm assigning to them when I'm listening to them, and why is that? And that's something that we can all sort of work on, and the other thing that's really important to remember, I can curse, right? We're all gonna fuck up, and that has to be okay too. That's part of for people who've done political organizing. You're not gonna arrive at like a fully formed good consciousness the day you wake up and decide you want to do something about the world. It's an ongoing process, and things change too. I'll stop there.
Thank you. How are we feeling over here about
I'm feeling amazing.
our binaries and our biases?
I'm feeling I don't know. It is a complicated question, and the bias is totally there for sure. In various perspectives. The example we were talking about that comes to mind lately is this discussion I had with rap blogger, definitely white male cis rap blogger, and he was pointing out that there was this one all-female band of rappers who got booked in a festival. He was like, you know, that feels for me that it's favoritism. What's the word in English? Favoritism? Yeah.
Favoritism?
Yeah,
favoritism.
That word. And he was saying that, yeah, he felt that they didn't necessarily deserve that place, and they got booked there to address these quotas or whatever. So there was definitely a bias for them to be in this festival. To which I answered, well, I got booked in this festival. I was really happy to be playing at this festival, but I was booked later on. It was like an outside. And at 8 p.m. on the same stage that I was playing was this horrendous all-male rap band that was playing. But never the quality of this band would be questioned because all dudes. So it's just normal that they're there. They're fitting a certain criteria, or certain kind of trend right now in rap music. And so they could, I'm sorry, but they could suck, and it's fine because they're kind of, but if the female band is equal quality or, you know, whatever, then they don't deserve that place because they're all female, and so therefore there's favoritism for them. So for these types of examples, I try to, it's like very instinctive. People don't think about that, but you kind of have to dismantle these ideas, and that takes a lot of time, and it's certainly like, we're all, I guess everyone here, we were addressing this also, everyone here is kind of, has already a sensibility to these issues, and we're kind of, I hope you get to learn stuff, but I know that a lot of you are already very aware of these issues. What I like is to be able to address these issues with people who have no idea, who's never thought about these things, and we don't get that chance very often.
Yeah, just to reiterate, I'll bring an example of a strategy that I have teaching, just to bring back, and also to what Jonathan was saying. Because when I started learning, when I was in the scene, in the rave scene, but then I was in university and I thought, hey, I love partying and I want to study this more, I want to know more about it. And of course I went to the library and looked at books, and it was all these books of male composers and the male scene and so on. And so actually I should say I'm starting to work on co-editing a collection of the history of women in electronic music with someone. But so that is to say that in my classes what I try to do is not make women in the scene, in the history, as kind of novel, and I try to sort of tactically make it sort of, not ordinary, but like that they exist there. So getting, you know, articles that women have been writing about women artists and bringing in women artist examples so that when these students are learning about electronic music, which is, this isn't even in electronic music classes, I just bring it into all my classes because I think it's important. And I weave it in, and I bring in those examples so that when they're thinking about this or thinking about history, that's who they have their frame of mind. Especially when you're young, you sort of pick up certain kind of keywords or buzzwords or an artist. So that's just something that I really try to do. Is we can discuss all the gendered stuff, but first just kind of get them in and not get them in the history that has been. So I'm doing a sort of revisionist history, which is what all the men have been doing. So.
I just would want to hold on this thought for just a second, because in the context of Keychange, I think that when I was invited, And I think when a number of other artists were invited, there's always this push and pull between saying like, well, I don't want to just be invited to something because I'm a female identifying artist, right? Like there seems to be, it seems to be when it's a self-identified group, using your binaries or perhaps like your labels is, you know, seen as liberating or an act of resistance. But when you're being asked, you know, to identify yourself, whether it's in the media where, you know, in one sense saying like trans artists at the Grammys, it's a simultaneously liberating and also reinforcing mechanism of the kind of the problem that we're in. And I'm just curious if you have any examples of catching yourself or with other people when you're having discussions about whether it's your own positionality in gender or trying to explain to someone else why in one context, sure, like I do want to identify as a female artist, I push that, but in other contexts, I don't want that to be the primary lead on how I'm identified.
Well, my issue is I don't identify as female, right? But I get booked to every panel or show about women. I'm here. And there was this show actually that I was booked for that was called the Rap Battle for Representation. And trans people got misgendered on stage so many times because the hostess was like, oh, look at all these beautiful women on stage, so much estrogen, and just like all night. And it was really for them, like for all the cis women on stage, it felt really empowering. But for the trans people, it was really it was honestly felt like you were being stabbed. Like you were on stage or you were in the crowd and everybody's staring at you like. And I was singing, and it's like, I know people, like, the thing is, that's something that I don't know a lot of artists that have experienced that. But when I'm introduced as trans and then I go on stage, people don't look at me in my eyes, they look around here. You know, and it's little things like that. And at that show, too, like, there was one of the organizers who was really drunk and was running after all the trans people, being like, oh, I thought we were friends, and just, like, getting really close and basically, like, sexually harassing us while the cis women were on stage singing a song about Me Too. And those are all things that, like, are really tough because that's also a thing. You know, like I said before, people are like, oh, it's a men's world or whatever. And so when they look at me, they're like, but you don't need to be booked. You don't need to be here. You don't need to, because you're a man, so what? And I'm like, okay, but like, you don't understand that when people open my papers, they don't see men. Even when I say I'm trans, most cis people, like I know what they're thinking about. When I say I'm trans, they're like, oh my God, so wait, facial hair? Okay, so wait, so what's in the pants though? You know, like, and it's like they're not saying it out loud. But when you're a trans person, you become really, really, really good at reading people's thoughts, you know? And so that's a thing that, for me, is really tough to like get accepted into spaces that people say that I'm already accepted in, and having access to that privilege that people said I transition into. And like, you know, in the bio on the website, it's written like, oh, like I'm one of the leaders of the Black trans community worldwide, and I'm still trapping to pay rent. Because Black trans people, in average, we make less than $10,000 a year. Our life expectancy is 35 years old. Black trans men and trans women are regularly murdered and assaulted, and most of us, like when I hang out with my friends, like who are Black trans people, it's like when we talk about sex work, we all have done it. And so it's little things like that. And then it's like, oh, but it's a men's world, you're good. No, I'm not good. Like, and people don't back up their words with the actions, and it's really tough because it's like they're fetishizing trans women in a way that's like, I'm here for you, but I'm not actually here for you though, but I'm here for you on paper. And trans men, it's like, oh, you transitioned to be a man, like you just basically joined the enemy type shit. Like, oh, you gave up on your womanhood to join the man, like, ugh. You know, but that's basically how people treat us. And so for me, it's true that all these conversations about gender, it's like, sometimes it's tough because I'm wondering, but are people actually seeing me for who I am? Or are people seeing me as like, oh, but you're just a super butch woman type shit, you know? So, yeah.
I don't know if you want to take like a peek at the slide that I put up, which is a pretty popular meme. But I think that that's relevant to, even why having you and Jonathan, other people on these panels, is to make sure that it's not a kind of a self-fulfilling complaints choir or kind of speaking to ourselves, right? And there's a lot of listening that has to be done by women, like cis women in music and cis women in general. And I think hearing just those types of stories is really important for people to start to consider, how do I work with trans folks? Like how do I make space and yet not tokenize? You know, how do I find points of contact that are mutually beneficial, right?
And it's also about race, right? Because when you talk about music, you talk about different types of music besides hip-hop, which hip-hop is owned by white people right now, and it's really like the whole like idea that it's vehiculating about black people most of the time is not what we want to talk about ourselves. But when you talk about, for example, electronic music, rock, indie folk, where are the black men? And if it was really about gender, wouldn't there be black men everywhere? You know what I mean? Like, it's so many issues. Where are the queer black men? Where are the disabled men? Because we have, when we think about this men's world, we think about this is a white, cis, abled, kind of cute-looking guy, you know? That's what it is. And the thing is, like, it's true that we have to go beyond these conversations of binary, and we have to be intersectional whenever we're talking about gender. So, yeah.
Yeah,
Magda?
Thanks for that. Yeah, I think what I've been, one, I want to say, I guess, 2 points. One, that I've been thinking about for a long time is trying to undo my kind of forcedness that I used to think that women or other people that are not totally represented within the scene should speak out on their positions. And this is what I used to think. I'd be like, well, if you are marginalized and you are a woman, well, like, speak out about your experience because other people need to hear it and you need to speak out about it, and why aren't you speaking out about it? If you're not, then you're sort of wanting to play into this world and so on, and all these assumptions I used to have. And only in the last while, I've realized that, like you're saying, right, that people in certain spaces will identify a certain way because they feel that they can take risks within that community, and in certain ways and in certain contexts, they're not going to, and that's okay. And you can identify and be in certain ways, or use a specific language and perform in certain ways in specific milieus. And I think it's super important. And especially, like, I really see that as, you know, who gets asked certain kinds of questions by journalists, even by each other, and so on, right? And it's okay if you don't want to answer, and not even that, but you shouldn't be kind of pushed into that. So I've really been trying to think about, like, what does it mean that you know, yeah, want to identify in certain spaces and not in others. But the other thing I want to say is that just recently I've been going to a night here in Montreal. It's a really cool night, whatever. I'm not going to mention it though. But and the guys who started this night, you know, want to be all inclusive, and they're saying, yeah, they're nice guys, whatever. But you know, they don't understand that, you know, women just don't come. I'm the only woman that's really come. And they don't understand, well, we want to be inclusive, we're open to everyone. I'm like, okay, and? Like, there's a certain level of work that we have to do, that I have to do, right? So some of the stuff you're talking about, it's like, oh yeah, people say, oh, you know, trans, you know, for sure, come on in. But it's like, well, okay, and? Right? What has to happen? And I think what I'm really thinking about right now is really trying to dismantle, especially my white supremacy, and how being, you know, complicit in the system, my ableism, my ageism, and now that I've become a parent, you know, how I used to think about people without that, and really trying to figure out how to get to doing the work and not making other people do the work for you, but trying to do the work. And it's really fucking hard. And if it's not hard, then you're probably not doing the work, right? Like, it's gotta hurt a little bit, because we're within these structures, within these, like, patriarchal, ableist, you know, cisgendered, comfortable, right? And like, sometimes giving up the space, right? Just giving it up, not making space, but trying to figure out how to give up that space too. And it's okay.
Thanks for that. I'm going to bounce to our next bucket. And I know that I'm thinking of our previous conversations where there's so much that I want to kind of prompt and uncover from these panelists. You have so much to offer. But we'll take a peek at our next kind of bucket, which is the idea that representation is not equity. And we've touched on this to some degree, which is the idea of numbers for numbers' sake, or tokenizing in certain conditions, or even just how numbers show up in textbooks, right, or the histories that we teach. Even if those numbers change, whether drastically or over a more casual period of time, that doesn't necessarily mean that we've achieved equity. And one example that I can give is just the idea that you can have an all-female or a very balanced female trans artist non-identifying lineup, but that all the people that run that festival or platform or company are all either white men or someone in a position to those artists that is in an oppressive position, right? So we really have to look at ownership and where power is. And a conversation I had with a friend last night was, well, if we looked at a company and it was 50 people in a company and 4 of them were women, the immediate gut reaction would be like, well, that's not equitable, or that, that's not fair, that's not equitable. But if those 4 women were the company owners, it's a different story. Or so it would be perceived as a different story. So I'm wondering, in terms of representation and equity, if you have kind of any points of entry, maybe you're experiencing something right now, getting to this point that you were making about come in, we want you to perform. Is there anybody in charge that represents the identities that you're trying to welcome in?
I guess this I experienced more at Centre Clark, the Artist One Center I work for. The center has had historically a very homogeneous white programming, with a few exceptions. In the last years, we've tried to shift this. The first attitude we usually have is, well, we select from a call for proposals and people aren't applying, so we can't do it. And a bit like to touch on what you were saying, well, people aren't applying because why would they? They have no space. So you can't, you have to send a clear signal, and you have to do that work. You have to go ask people to apply. You have to really handpick them to create new models and shift their organization. But beyond that, the programming committee and who is on the programming committee and who's the members and what's the staff, that has a big impact also. And so what we're doing right now is we're trying to shift the culture of the organization to also make sure that not only that we start by programming artists that come from diversity and just have a less homogeneous programming, but we also, by that, are changing the culture of the organization and making sure that eventually they'll become members, they'll be on the programming committee, they'll be on the board, and really do that shift from within. And I think that if you do that shift from within, then that is way more sustainable on the long run, because you're not just doing like these, very obvious things, but you're really changing systematically how the organization works. And I think, yeah, that's our vision of it.
I'm going to speak in favor of quotas for a minute, just because I think, you can sort of wait around for social change, or you can take the steps that you can take. And I think in situations where there is a presumption of cis white male supremacy, and people aren't even aware of that presumption, to say, why isn't this festival 50% women? Why isn't this syllabus or bibliography 50% women in a woman-dominated field, which is an issue in my field in terms of citational politics? I think it's a fair question to ask, and it's a good way of getting people to check their behavior and to say, okay, what implicit biases am I bringing to things? So I do actually think it's a useful step. The problem would be if you did that step and said, okay, good, we're done, everybody's equal now. And I understand that it puts, in the first moment, it does put the people who don't fit the dominant category, whatever that category is, on the spot, as it were, like, a credit to your race, a credit to your gender kind of bullshit. But I think I think it's a valuable step to take. It's better than nothing. It's not a solution to the problem, but it's a step in the right direction. And most importantly, it's a tool for education, because you put the people in the spaces where they weren't before, And then all these implicit biases built into the spaces, like a music festival, come to the fore and start getting dealt with. And it's difficult and it's awkward, but it can be quite, I think, productive as well. And I don't actually know of a better way than just, you know, sort of trying to do that. So that's my sort of soft pitch in favor of quotas as a way of educating people. Yeah, okay, thanks. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that, you know, you asked about sort of struggling with this stuff yourself. One of the things I struggle with as somebody who clocks as cis, white, male, able-bodied, even though I have a couple disabilities that aren't visible necessarily, is that when do you like stop the conversation and intervene when you're addressed in that way by other people who are embodying that category as well? Like, so in conversations between cis-identified white men, where do I say, hey, wait, that's no good? Don't say that. Like, there's moments where you can intervene, and there's moments where it's actually counterproductive because you'll lose the person rather than educate them, right? I mean, again, it's an organizing issue. I don't see it as like a moral quandary or whatever. But when do you say something and when do you let something go in order to build trust to say something more substantial at a later point? And like, I don't fucking know. I get it wrong all the time. I say the wrong thing at the wrong time. It's hard, and you know, and if you don't know people that well, it's also it's a guessing game, really. If you're trying to sort of undermine your own privilege and say, hey, wait, that you can't say that, or that's not actually how it works.
I'd like to also pause on this one and dive a little bit deeper with the idea of measurement. And just the idea, first of all, can we check like our Instagram likes right now? How many hashtags do we have going for this event? Right? We are quantifying our success all the time. We're operating on platforms that in some ways kind of mimic like a digital fascism to some degree, but we are all participating in this. Many marginalized artists, whether they're female, black, trans, have been able to use these platforms to start to push conversations and gain power, whether it's pushing a conversation to move people to financially benefit, socially benefit, or to actually change policies. I'm wondering if you have any kind of feelings about this kind of quantifiable world that we're living in right now, the hashtags of our identity in our lives. Are they working for you or against you or both?
I mean, I wouldn't know I was trans if I didn't have social media. Like, that's the thing. Like, one of the reasons why I managed to, like, get out there and stuff is because I have other people to talk to, and hashtags allowed me to find people to follow, find people to friend, and just learn about myself, really. And then, of course, like, it brings a lot of haters and stuff because people feel a lot more safe behind the screen so they can say whatever they want. But I don't know, like, especially like when you think about Black Lives Matter and you think about all these movements, like hashtags are really important because they help us mobilize people. Like, I don't have any money, but I can mobilize people. For example, like, you know, everybody probably here heard about Slav. There was a show made by Robert Lepage and Betty Bonifaci, yeah, where basically Betty Bonifaci was playing Harriet Tubman, and it was like white people playing black slaves picking cotton, right? And that show was going to happen. Like, nobody, like, it was one of the biggest, it was the biggest selling show at the Jazz Fest of Montreal. Oh, it did happen, but wait, we stopped it. Why? Because we had the internet, like, literally, because I made a post, like, the whole movement started, like, I made a post on my Facebook being like, yo, did you see this is happening? Just so you know, this is their Facebook page, and y'all can go tell them how you feel about it. And then people started reaching out to me being like, is there a demo happening? And I was like, sure, why not? And so I just made a few graphics and put them on Facebook, and the next day we had 150 people in front of the theater. a black trans person can't get 150 people in front of a theater to, you know what I mean? And it was cis people that were here protesting with me. And then we did a whole show where like, that was called Support Black Artists once the Slap show was canceled. And we, like, I basically used like the hashtag Support Black Artists on Facebook and didn't tell nobody to line up. And I put trans people on stage, like it was mostly black trans people on stage and the room was full. And the thing is, like, those are things that we would have never been able to do if we didn't have those social media and those hashtags and stuff, because we don't have, like, the trans community specifically, we don't want, like, black trans community specifically, we don't have any buying power, right? So all we have is the algorithms on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter to get our voices heard. We can't pay for somebody to promote us, or we can't pay for, you know, so that's all we have. And it's hurtful in a lot of ways, but it's also has saved our community. So
I mean, for me, social media is like, it's like homework. It's horrendous. Like you kind of have to do it to have visibility. You have to do it to have people hear your voice. But I mean, there's so many other things I would rather do with my time. I'm so not responsive. Like I think about like being clever. I'm like, it takes me 3 days and I'm not clever in the end. I'm just like, I'm gonna, you know, it's just like a fail for me, but it's part of this industry, or like whatever you want to call it, like Patty said, and it's part of the expectations, I think, of it. And but then yeah, I use this as a tool to promote my work, and then I get to do interviews or be on panels and talk about feminism and talk about things that I think we don't address enough, and I infiltrate. And so I need to do these things to be able to infiltrate in the end.
Is there a hashtag socialize social media? Because there should be.
Someone want to
because
check
they're
that?
so essential. They're so essential to political organizing, for certain types of organizing. They're so essential to musicians' careers, and yet we are all sort of at the mercy of Facebook, like doing, you know, sort of experiments with, you know, my favorite example of this is Facebook getting musicians and bands and artists to promote themselves online and then intentionally sort of downgrading those posts unless you pay for them. Right, so it becomes part of their, they get their users to do free research for them, and then they try to monetize it. And I mean, I'd say the same thing with Twitter, and if you read the news, you know that people running these organizations have very little understanding of the social issues that are being worked out on their own platforms. And in fact, they use the term platform to absolve themselves of responsibility, saying we're just the platform. But you know, that's precisely why, if you said, why don't we treat these things as public utilities instead of for-profit entities for a small number of people, it would be a very different dynamic. Of course, that's not going to happen, at least not tomorrow. But it is something to think about, that these media businesses, and I mean, as machine learning and facial recognition technology and everybody's microphone listening to them all the time become more and more important, this is also an issue people need to organize around, and it's going to be tied to every other social justice issue, and of course, you know, the organizing around the environment as well, because these technologies take a tremendous amount of energy as well.
Great, thanks. I feel like we could we could go down this rabbit hole so long. Just a phrase that I think, you know, a lot of us know, but I wanted to harken back to the nothing about us without us, and just pointing back to, I think that each of you have said, if there's nobody kind of at the table making those like executive level decisions, we're really not getting there. Where are we at? Okay, so we've touched on this a bit, is just the idea of merit. And the question is, well, valued by whom, right? Our point of references for merit, even how we got here today, how y'all got here today, or had the privilege to be here this morning and not at work somewhere. I think this dives us into an even deeper problem, which is to hold at many times multiple value points, right? How do we actually begin to start to identify different value systems when we encounter one another, and come up with solutions that are going to represent both values or change both values for a more equitable experience for all artists? So I wonder if you could share any examples of where that has been successful for you, when you've maybe worked with someone that you did not expect that to be a meeting point of values, or perhaps something that you found very challenging that you would never do again.
Well, okay. So, well, for me, like, for example, one of the things that I think about a lot is I think about a hip-hop artists that are in the top 40 right now, right? Specifically, like, I always use the example of Drake, okay? So Drake, everybody knows Drake, right? Canadian rapper, makes so much money that his pool is worth $7 million. So this is, for me, that's huge, right? And when you think about how much money goes into his albums and how much of a team he has behind him. Because when you think about artists like that, for example, like Lady Gaga had an album flop, she fired 250 people. So there's so many people working behind these artists, and they have so many resources. And whenever people talk to me about Drake, and they're like, oh my God, like, you know, like, as if I should take him as an example, as my mentor, as like something to look up to, I'm like, okay, but if you put Drake in my apartment with my budget, he can't do what I do, you know? Because I keep saying like, oh, like, you know, I can't pay rent and all this shit, and I produced the world's first trans hip-hop mixtape, but with what budget? I didn't have a budget. I did it myself with internet and no budget at all. And could Drake do what I'm doing with my resources? No, he could not. So valued by who? Like, I personally think that the people on my label are a lot more resourceful and a lot more talented than the rappers on the top 40 right now. So I'm not going to look at Drake, J. Cole, Kendrick Lamar, and all these guys who don't give a fuck about people like me and think that they're geniuses, because if I put anybody on my label with these resources, we would do better. And so for me, that's why. Valued by whom? It's valued by money. And the thing is, like I said, black trans people, we make an average $10,000 a year less. Obviously, nobody's gonna value us. And then that goes for everything. Like, last year, I was undocumented, my papers got refused, and I spent 1 year without papers. Why? Because I didn't have money. If I had money, people would have given me my papers. So in the end, like, value is, it's money, like, and that kind of goes back, like, it keeps oppressing the same people over and over again. And yeah.
Magda, I want to ping you for a minute and talk about specifically female artists' value inside the music industry system. The difference between, say, how we as a culture value the solo artist versus kind of erasing the engineers or the people behind the scenes. Do you have any, I know we had talked about this briefly, but I think it was really helpful information.
Yeah, well, yes, and I just wanted to say, so important what you're saying about resources, and especially I think also how we put in some ways on this really frustrating pedestal people who can make it without anything, but then not go forward with that. Like, yes, that's fucking great, but you also want money too. Like, you know, and you deserve it. And like, what, you know, when we put, and I'm thinking about, you know, certain people on festival lineups, are they getting paid the same amount of money? I have no idea. Like, I loved the graphic that was shown earlier from Female Pressure, but I'm curious, are those female artists, are they the headliners, or are they just part of the bill? Is there one headliner and then 10 other men? And how much are they getting paid, or are they paying to play? I don't know. And of course, that's a volunteer effort, so you did amazing, but I'm curious about the nuances of that. And then to go to your point about something that I've written about and think about is, you know, what is our industry culture it's not just the performers, right? So it's also the people that are videoing this so that other people can see. It's the moderators, it's the people who are doing the catering so we can have our coffee, and all those people that make it up, and also and engineers and so on. And we need more. There's women in those roles, but also we need women in all, and other people in all parts of that, right? So when you're thinking about what the culture is made out of, it's not just the the composer or the DJ. It's other people too, right? And also the emotional labor and the backstage support that people give to those who are able to perform and so on, right? So.
Roxanne, when we talk about value, maybe in terms of media perception or how media kind of helps translate value to an audience, you had mentioned to me an album that you put out, was it 2008? You mentioned that the themes in that album are very similar to the album that you're putting out now, but it was written about, perceived, and kind of valued in a different way than it is now. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah. So I put out an album in 2008. A lot of my lyrics are very explicit, and I often do metaphors between food and sex. It's like comes very naturally to me. And so it is still on the latest album I put out. But at the time in 2008, all the reviews and the interviews were really centered around sex and the fact that it was shocking, or it was, I remember this one article was like, au lit avec Donzelle. I was like, in bed with Donzelle. And I was like, oh, come on. Because we really, on stage, we really strive to doing to empower women, to have body diversity, to address difficult issues, but in a party way. We have costumes that are always kind of awkward, and we try to just, create new models and just shift the discussion a bit. And so this was really the discussion in 2008. Obviously, I haven't changed that much, so the subjects have just evolved and maybe more nuanced, but the sex metaphors or whatever are still there. But when I released the album in 2008, May, this last May, I've done a lot of interviews, and they're all centered around Me Too, around feminism, and the topics have completely shifted. I think it's great. I mean, my album doesn't address necessarily the Me Too movement at all, but it is talking about empowerment and about feminism. So people have kind of like that open door, media open door that they kind of want to dive into, and I'm fine with that if that permits us to talk about more complex and difficult issues. But yeah, it's quite interesting how that has happened.
Yeah, I think that what we're kind of pointing to is that in media, that there's a currency there, whether the people writing about it know it or not. And we're in a current struggle about like what to do with that currency, right? Whether it's imposed upon you, like in, let's see, this case. Let's look at this one. Did you send this to me? Did you send this to me? Oh, yeah. So let's just, I think how we talk about these things right now that we've kind of outlined some of these buckets and how they intersect, I think going back to how we speak about these things, which is primarily online, or how we're ingesting this information, just let's look at some of this. Like, scored by a female composer, like is that their name? And a first, for a superhero film. And of course, quickly people are like, no. Not true, and kind of coming at it being like, yeah, is their name female composer? Like, how are we speaking about these things, and how are we participating in that problem? Which I know that in that struggle for visibility, or in that kind of hashtag game. Great, thank you. Sorry. We are simultaneously participating in either languages or systems that maybe are creating more problems for ourselves. And that's a consistent unfurling. I think when I was saying at the beginning of this, it's not that there's going to be one answer that we pop out at the end and say like, well, this is how we escape this. Or, oh, we're all screwed, like we're all participating in this, just let's give up. And I think of Fred Moten's Undercommons, or just the idea of like constant revision and constantly returning to a problem, which I think panels like this or the rest of your time here is really a very privileged opportunity to do that, to keep like re-encountering yourself inside of these problems. It's not the problem of someone else's, it's actually our own. And let's take a little look. So this leads me to kind of my final bucket, which is just the idea of discourse, and the idea that we have to move in some way beyond hashtags or call and response that we spend most of our time doing online, because time in person is very limited, either one-to-one or when we're together as a group, it's very rare. I wanted to give my own like self-reflexive meme on this one. Yeah, who wants to lazily condense complex political issues into memes? I mean, I do sometimes, but we all do. We find ways of distilling very complex ideas into very simple, digestible pieces of material, whether that's how we put an artist on a lineup or how we're trying to just quickly communicate perhaps a sense of despair or urgency. We do collapse into these forms of communication. I'm wondering, finally, is there a place for any of you where you feel that like true discourse is happening right now? Where we're not screaming at each other, but actually talking with each other?
I mean, I feel that most of the time, most of my discussions are very constructive, and but I feel also I'm living in a bubble, and when it comes to actually the rare occasions where I am addressing these difficult topics with people who are not either educated on them or not open to hearing about it, it becomes a very hard discussion right away. And also, it's kind of because I'm in this situation where I talk about these issues, and a lot of us are, I'm sure here also, we become responsible, we become like spokespeople for these issues, and you don't always want to have that responsibility, you don't always have to want to defend them, like you were saying, you have to choose your moments and topics and occasions, but sometimes people really like, I remember this one occasions, all my friends, like very close friends, were all in my living room, and they started talking about politics and racism, and I kind of couldn't believe what I was hearing, and they all turned to me and they were like, "It's your turn, come on, speak for everyone, educate us." And then I did, and then I had a big backlash, and they wanted me to go again, and I was like, you know, like, I'm not a circus animal also, like, if you're open to this discussion, I will talk, but I'm not your teacher, I don't always want to have that role. And that's me coming from my cisgendered position, but I can just imagine for you, Lucas, like, the pressure is immense, and you don't always want to have that role, but you kind of have to sometimes.
Well, speaking as a teacher, I actually do think classrooms are a place where this can happen. I mean, there's a lot of press coverage, negative press coverage of what happens in universities, especially humanities, social science classrooms around inequality. But my experience isn't that it actually, those spectacular examples are precisely that, the things that, you know, feed. If it bleeds, it leads, for an old journalism maxim. But classrooms are spaces that are designed to educate people, to meet people in different positions and coming from different places, to expose them to different perspectives, and to do that hard work. And it's, you know, I'm actually paid to be patient with people. And so I do. The other thing I'd say is organizing. I don't think in this, like social media are great for organizing and getting people out and things like that. They're terrible for having a serious conversation. For one thing, the algorithms are getting in your way. For another, there's like a word limit on, you know, a character limit on Twitter. Sure, they increased it. And sure, people do those like numbered posts, but like, you know, I could also write something in any other medium where I don't have to do that. You know, and I think actually getting out and talking to people, I mean, this is the old model of organizing that social movements have had basically forever, which is you have to go meet people where they are, and you have to talk to them, you have to have awkward conversations, and you have to listen if you want to persuade. And that's something that I think social media are really, and the cultures that have grown up around them are really bad at, is teaching people that they have to learn to be persuasive and try different things, because like one thing isn't going to work with everybody. And if you're really committed to social change, that means doing that work that you don't want to do in certain situations where you do have to persuade people, and it's probably not going to happen. That part of it isn't going to happen on Facebook or Instagram. You might get people to the protest, but you're probably not going to change minds online.
I disagree.
Yeah, I disagree too, actually.
Awesome.
Yeah.
What?
Awesome.
I'm trying to get y'all there. Like, I want to get into it a little bit.
Yeah, so trans people, if we talk to people in real life, we get killed. So
Sorry?
I'm not going to do that. If
Sorry?
I talk to people, if I go meet the people who are against me in person, that's how we die. So social media for us is a really big thing, because how many trans women do you hear that they get killed as soon as they tell people they're trans? How many trans guys does that happen to? Obviously, like, there's a thing, like, black trans guys are not, their murders are not reported because a lot of cis people don't even know that trans guys exist. When you say trans, they're like, they look at me and they're like, oh, so you want to become a woman? Like, you know? And the thing is, like, do I really, for me, I don't believe in meeting people halfway. If you don't believe that I exist or I should have the right to exist, I'm not going to meet you halfway and be like, actually, you're kind of right. No. You know, and I also don't believe about like talking at each other, talking to each other. I don't believe that that's actually also a good thing, because sometimes people just need to shut the fuck up and listen. So this thing that I say in my workshops often, I have this metaphor. It's called the microphone metaphor. Okay, so imagine you're on this on stage at the Madison Square Garden. Okay. It's completely crowded, you know, so you're trying to speak, but you don't have a microphone, so you're just like speaking louder and louder and louder and louder until your vocal cords break, and nobody has heard you because Madison Square Garden, if y'all don't know, it's big, you know. And the thing is, like, somebody, you know, puts a microphone in front of you, then it's like, or somebody comes in front of you, and I can't even talk to you anymore. I broke my vocal cords. So even if I want to talk to you without a lot of energy, you still won't hear me. What do people need in that situations? We need microphones. But the thing is, what does the microphone do when the person is not on stage? Nothing, right? And that's what allies are supposed to be. Allies are supposed to be microphones, which is also why, like, when do you stop explaining to people something? When you realize that you're talking about an experience that you haven't lived. And you have to admit, like, I think that the one thing that people don't want to, because they're too prideful, is admit that you don't understand. Because somebody that comes to me and be like, I don't understand your life as a black trans guy, I'm going to be like, I appreciate that. Because the second that you say you understand is the second that you're going to start explaining to people. And when you start explaining to people, you're speaking over me. And then you're going to distort the message. And you're going to explain to people the experience of a black trans guy that you don't understand. Because in the end, I don't understand what it's like to be a white cis woman, for example. I don't understand y'all's experience, and y'all don't understand mine. But one thing that music has taught us, and that is really important to remember, is that even when we can't understand, we can relate, right? So if, for example, I'm talking to you about, like, for example, like, oh, I feel really alone because my family doesn't support me. Somebody who has a really supportive family, you can't understand what it's like, but you can relate to that feeling of loneliness. You can relate to that feeling of pain, and that's why I make music, because when you hear the music, even when it's somebody that doesn't speak your language, you can relate to the feelings in it. And when you relate, you start listening because you want to understand. You'll never understand, but you listen, and then that's when listening is what actually will make you change things. And in order for us to be able to go in the street and be able to like face people, because there's also a reason why this is me here and my skin is that light. You know what I mean? Like that also gives me a lot of privilege over other black people. And there's a reason why I'm sitting here and other black trans people are not sitting here, because we die. You know what I mean? And so that's why, like, for me, like, I believe social media is really great, because I feel a lot safer when I'm in my house behind my computer and my dog is here to keep my door. But if I go in the front and I go meet the Nazis who think I don't exist and I'm trying to have a conversation with them, it doesn't matter how well I explain it. In the end, I'm the one who's going to get hurt. So, yeah.
Did you have a quick point you wanted to
Sure. Well, just to, I don't know if I can follow that, but maybe I can say is that certain people that are not in as vulnerable are the ones that need to be then on the front lines, right? Because I think we need both, and I believe also social media. And I just wanted to give a shout out to this free online thing that I did of Wild Mystic Woman, who did this Me and White Supremacy challenge on Instagram. And if you want to check it out, it was just really life-changing for me. But that is to say that, yes, I think social media is super key, but I think also for those of us who are able to be on those front lines, need to step up for the people that can't and are more vulnerable, right? And figuring out our space. And the final thing is what I loved, what you said is like, what the fuck do we value? And how did we get to valuing those things? And thinking about meritocracy, talent, or the people we see, or who's speaking, or like, yeah, why are you valuing what I'm saying? How are you evaluating if what I'm saying is even useful, or what any of us are? And just thinking about the festival and the workshops, that was really great. So.
Well, we're almost done here, and we're going to open it up to questions. But I just wanted to bounce through some other images. These were searches that I made this morning. And I just wanted to point out kind of being able to hold multiple and or conflicting ideas at the same time, which is like perhaps a method that we are employing already in our lives to try to work through some of these issues. And what I found really weird about this, speaking about like being at home in front of your computer by yourself, like the idea of learning through isolation, in some ways that being a tool for protection, but in other ways that being just a kind of K-hole for misinformation or confusing information, or like information that doesn't lead you where you thought you wanted to go. So I'm like, why, like if I just was, off the cuff, well, why are gender quotas good? Like, well, I want to see a meme on that so it can give me a quick answer, and they make me laugh. But actually all of these are like, most of the top search results are what you'd read as right-wing answers to saying why they're bad or mocking them. And so if a lot of people on day-to-day basis, you're receiving this information constantly, like in your feeds or when you're making searches, trying to educate yourself, when you're lacking dialogue, right? When you're lacking the ability to encounter that opposite opinion, there is no dialogue here, right? And you kind of find yourself in these stopgaps or like these loops in thinking, which might unfortunately reinforce your own biases as well. But some of this stuff I was like, wow, all right.
There's transphobia too. Like, see,
Yeah.
when I was talking about it, it's about cis men. Look at the second one. I think gender quotas are bullshit. People should be hired based on their skills, not whether or not they have a vagina. I'm just saying, a lot of men out there have vaginas, and so that's how you can tell that like this
I think these results are pretty amazing. I mean, they're going to. I think these are really helpful because we don't really need a preaching to the choir moment with all of us, but we need to look at like, how are we gaining our information and kind of building our tools for argumentation and thinking around these issues, and what are we trusting, right? And what are we valuing? On the more posy side, for this conversation, like you were saying earlier, there are a lot of people that are using social media and other forms of discourse to their benefit. People that are working with technologies that we might find to be problematic or oppressive. They're trying to kind of hack those or find other ways to use them for their own liberation. And with that, I think we should open it up to the floor. Thank you.
Hi, I know that at least 3 of you, I don't know about your practice, Jonathan, but at least 3 of you on that couch have been bookers. This is a role that I think that is particularly crucial in terms of what ends up on the stages, either at some pay what you can, you know, benefit up the street at Cleo's, or whether you're talking about across the street at Club Soda, you know? And so how do you work as bookers to make sure that you are putting avant-garde work out there, but without the tinge of tokenization, because the smirch of tokenization is very real as a white booker. You know, I book, you know, I would put you on a panel or on a lineup at any time, Lucas, because I like what you do and I like what you say. But if I'm booking a show and you're the only one, you know, you're the only trans man in my lineup, people would say, oh, well, you know?
I never come alone, though. That's how I do it. Even when I'm the only person, I always bring people from my label with me. So that's how you do it, right? Even when you're the one being tokenized, just bring a shitload of people with you. Make sure you're not the only one.
Done.
And also, like, every single show because, yeah, like you said, I'm a booker. I just don't have a lot of money to pay the people I book, sadly. By the way, if you want to sponsor that, hit me up after. I'm friendly. But every single show I book, I make sure that my tokens are white and cis. Because most of my lineup is trans, and most of my lineup is going to be black people. Like, you know that right away if you come to a show that I'm organizing. Like, you can be sure that the people who are never headlining other shows are going to be headlining mine. You know, even if it's not promoted, like, even if I don't put the lineup online or whatever, you know that if you come to a show that I booked, you're going to see a shitload of trans people on stage, and that's how you do it. I can't tokenize my own people because I'm a black trans person, so obviously. But it's like booking people not just because of their identity, but like, yeah, the work they do, and make sure that, you know, if you book one person, one trans person, you book other people with it, or like, yeah, you just give them more money so that they can bring people in. Like, it's, you know, paying, actually, like, you know, it's okay to pay trans people more because guess what? Hormones are fucking expensive. Like, you know, being a trans person is really, 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 really expensive. And so, yeah, just pay them more, give them more money. That's it. Like, if you have to pay, like, book less cis people just so you can pay twice the trans artists twice as much, do it. Yeah, like, that's how, yeah.
I think for me, I don't book in music. I really program in visual arts. But the question is always of, so we do a call for submissions. We get 350 dossiers. But before that call, I really make sure that I went out and asked all the people that I really respect the work of, that that can make sure that I'm not in this streamlining white programming to apply. And so I make sure that the options are there and that my committee sees them, and I educate them, and we talk about them together. I'm not the only one doing it. Other members of the committee also do it. I encourage them to do it. And so at the end, we have like 15 proposals. We select 8 maybe, and we make sure that there's diversity in every way, not just gender-based, but also intergenerational. There's like all sorts of mediums, all sorts of aesthetics, visions, concepts, and you know, and then we have something that we can be proud of, and that sends out a clear message. And I think that the years that come after that, then it's easier because people feel that they have their place there. But it's a really slow-moving thing.
I just want the same. I will admit that when I was a rave promoter, and was thinking about these issues, I was not booking women because they were just not they were not around, and I wasn't doing the work. Wow. While I was like discussing these issues with other guys, like that's how deep-seated that shit is, that when I was in my 20s thinking about this, and having this like discrimination against me all the time, I still wasn't doing the work. Like it's, but in any case, so now like while have guest speakers in my classes. So I had a guest speaker, was Lawrence Philomene. I didn't book them because they're trans. I love their work, but it was really important for me to do that because I had a trans student in one of my classes, and I knew that they were just feeling out of place, and I wanted to do that for them. And I think that's fine. I didn't feel that was tokenizing because I was doing it for that student that was not going to get that opportunity, and to see someone doing the work that they wanted to do, right? To have the representation that you can be. It was a photography class. There's this photographer doing stuff for Vice, doing all this stuff, and is similar to you, and that's fucking really important, right? So I was not doing it for the other students, it was for this student. And the other thing is co-editing a special issue on women in electronic music. Also, a lot of work is, yeah, the initial responses that we got were from a certain kind of person, academic and so on, and it was up to me and my co-editor to go after other people and work with them, you know, and maybe they're like, I don't want to be in this academic journal, what the, and trying to explain to them that it's really important, and that you know, if we can help you, or sorry, you can help us actually, not we can help you, that's wrong. You can help us because we want to have your voice as part of this larger milieu, you know, that you're talking about that maybe is not exposed, right? So again, putting on the extra labor to have this happen, which you have to do.
I'd just like to add something also, which is interesting. I think it's, I'm not sure if it's the Québécois Art Council, but they're opening up also different ways of applying. I know for Skawanati is gone, but for First Nation artists, for instance, they will be allowed eventually to apply by video, which is great because it's also having access to the dialogue, the discourse, or even a computer, or how to apply to something. And it's also as a booker or as a programmer or whatever to allow people to approach you in different ways, and to give that space. Yeah, I think that can also change maybe something.
I don't book shows, but I guess as an academic, I'm a booker all the time. I book syllabi and bibliographies and conferences and
That lineup, though, Jonathan. Huh? I said that lineup, though.
And the thing I'd say is not only is it important to think about how you're selecting or not selecting people, but to demystify the process and say this is how you go about it. And that's something I do a lot because I work in an institution that has medieval origins and lots of very sort of bizarre and almost secretive like ways of doing things, and there's no reason for those things to be secret. And certainly, because I am also a musician, you know, it's not always clear how this person got to be in this place and that person got to be in that place. And if I was starting out, I think it would be a real struggle to figure out how to navigate without someone saying this is how it works. And you know, I mean, mentorship is also important, so like I appreciated Magda's point about like you can help us, but I do think if you control access to something, there are moments where it's also about saying people, here are the expectations that you will encounter if you move in my world.
I'd actually like to answer that too really quickly, which is something that I've been trying to do more and more, which is curating collaboratively and making that process very transparent. I think the initial, like it's almost like the blind date. Like when you initially are either asking someone to collaborate with you or someone like realizes that maybe you have something that they want, right? Like whatever that exchange is that like brought you together, like once you're there, I think it's always worth discussing, like, can we put this together, right? Not that I'm bringing you in or, you know, you're getting just something from me in like a one-time kind of exchange. And I've like worked with setting up, you know, different collectives, like where then in and of our collective, which has come from other groups of people, we have to find a whole other way of curating collaboratively and like acknowledging everybody in that process, which I think is just a good piece of homework to at least attempt.
I would just like to add another thing, but a bit like you were saying, I think a good way to go also at it is to say, listen, I'm going to give up my power on this night, in this evening. So I'm booking you, but you can invite whoever else you want to, and this is your budget. So you're giving them back the power, and that is a really constructive way for you to, you know, discover new artists, but also share creative selection, and I think that can also have a really positive impact.